It's really, real pleasure to see everybody here. Lots of faces that I know and some that I don't know. Welcome to this London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism event. I will mention that Samantha Cass is here, who is the campaigns officer of UJS, and we will come to her in good time, and she will speak after Izabella. But let me introduce to you the brilliant Izabella Tabarovsky. I was trying to remember where we first met, and I couldn't remember because it feels like you've been there forever. Izabella has an experience of anti-Semitism from her childhood and her family because she was brought up in the Soviet Union. And actually, it's one of the things that always interests me is that many people, when they think about contemporary anti-Semitism, have trouble really understanding it. And the people who understand it in the main are the people who have experienced it. And Izabella's experience of being excluded and being nullified by not only by the community of the good, but by the community of the good with state power and a gulag, I think is a very important aspect. Izabella is a fellow of many things because I think she is one of the absolutely foremost people who speak about and who understand the relationship between Soviet anti-Zionism and contemporary anti-Semitism. She is a senior fellow at Z3 out on the West Coast of the United States. She is a fellow at the Wilson Center, which is a brilliant think tank in the United States, in Washington, which I think had to deal with the Doge marching in and not really thinking very clearly about what he was going to cut. She is a fellow of the Compare Center at the University of Haifa, who we are proud to be organizing our conference with in March. And I can see people here who have abstracts accepted at that conference, and we're very excited about that. And she is, of course, most importantly, a fellow of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. And she's written loads of stuff for the tablet and chapters in books and all sorts of other things. Is this your first book? First book, which is exciting. He says, like, oh, you know, I've got loads, which I haven't. But anyway, first book, and I will ask Izabella to stand up. I think she's going to do what one should do at a book event, which is do a reading from the book. And I'm not sure if you're going to say something also, but anyway, let me introduce Izabella.
Thank you. Thank you, David, so much for this kind introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I want to thank David and my friends here, colleagues at the London Centre, Joey, Danny, Martine, and everybody else who have put an incredible amount of work to make this launch happen. David was among the first to notice my research into the Soviet origins and contemporary anti-Zionism, and to embrace my work and to invite me to join the center as a fellow, and I'm deeply grateful for that. Be a Refusenik isn't the book I was planning to write, but it is a book that came out in response to the times we're living in. It was born in the weeks after October 7th, in a conversation with a friend, David Hazoni, who became the book's editor. We were both in Philadelphia for the launch of another book he had edited and to which I had contributed an essay. It was 2 weeks since October 7th, or after October 7th. And like everyone else, we were watching the anti-Israel demonstrations explode on campuses and in the streets of American and European cities. And we realized that we needed to offer something that would serve as a model of courage, to remind us of the Jewish lineage of resistance and defiance. By then, I had been writing about the Soviet origins of today's anti-Zionism for several years. and that work attracted a lot of attention. But I had also been writing about the Refuseniks, Soviet Jewish activists who defied a massive totalitarian system. They were heroes to a previous generation of Jews around the world, including here in Britain, actually 2 generations at least of Jews around the world. But we as a Jewish people had inexplicably failed to pass on the story of their resistance and their struggle to the next generation. I had always been writing about them as role models whose story had become unexpectedly relevant for the current moment. And so we decided to build the book around that. The book we are launching tonight here in London is the product. It's a product of that conversation. I call tonight's talk informally From Victimhood to Defiance, Reframing Our People's Story for the Next Generation of Jews. And at its core, this is a book about Jewish courage, defiance, and reclaiming of that which is ours. Few people grow up dreaming of becoming a dissident. Most want to be loved and accepted by their family, friends, and the society they live in. Most become dissidents because life forces that choice on them. Being a dissident in the Soviet Union meant challenging the regime itself. In the free world today, it means defying dominant political or cultural norms in ways that threaten your career, your social standing, and your sense of belonging. Jews today, and young Jews especially, face an increasingly totalizing culture that demands they erase critical parts of their identity, particularly Zionism and their connection to Israel. Those who refuse face a stark choice between conforming and staying true to their beliefs. Choosing the latter places them outside the consensus at most elite universities. This consensus treats Israel as uniquely evil, recasts Zionism as a form of Nazism, and places Jews into an oppressor class in need of re-education. That choice places them in a dissident position vis-à-vis their peers, professors, and even administrators, or maybe even especially administrators. It may feel confusing and even devastating to realize that you no longer fit in. But defiance has always been at the heart of the Jewish story. From Abraham to Mordecai and onward, the Jewish people's founding narrative has always been one of courageous, principled resistance. Moses famously walked away from a life of privilege in Pharaoh's palace to lead his people to the promised land. Abraham smashed his father's idol shop and with it the prevailing paradigm of worship. Mordecai refused to bow to a powerful government official and set in motion the story of Jewish redemption. By saying no to those who denigrate, demonize, and delegitimize who you are as a Jew, you put yourself in a long line of Jewish heroes. This book is built on the idea that history not only helps us understand where we have been, but it also points the way forward. The Refusenik story is more than inspiring. It offers concrete strategies for confronting the assault on Jewish identity today. Before I continue, I want to say that drawing historical parallels requires care. The Brezhnev-era Soviet Union is not the contemporary United States or the United Kingdom. But while the systems are different, the patterns of demonization, ideological pressure, anti-Zionist ideological pressure, and anti-Zionist erasure are strikingly familiar. The fact that many of today's anti-Zionists identify openly and proudly as Marxist-Leninists, socialists, communists, and couch their views in the language of anti-imperialism, decolonization, and anti-capitalism, which is so familiar to me, having grown up in the USSR, makes the parallel even more pointed. As in the Soviet Union, the campaign of anti-Israel demonization and libel is not organic. It's slick and expensive. It's designed to manipulate emotion to achieve desired outcomes. And the desired outcome is to turn global public opinion against Israel Zionism, and ultimately Jews. As in the Soviet Union, this toxic ideology has captured entire institutions of culture, media, and academia. And above all, the aim of the strategy today is the same as it was then, to change who you are, to destroy the foundations of your Jewish identity, and to force you to submit to the anti-Jewish worldview or face potentially devastating consequences. And if the patterns of anti-Jewish oppression and erasure are repeating, it makes sense to turn to the experience of that earlier generation for guidance. How Jews responded then offers vital insights for now. The hostility students and Jews in general face from those who call themselves anti-Zionists may feel unprecedented, and some even call it new anti-Semitism. But in fact, there is little new about it. 50 years ago, young Soviet Jews faced a similar campaign of lies and libels about Zionism and Israel. Like you, they were expected to pass ideological litmus tests and pressured to disavow parts of their identity to succeed academically and professionally. Like you, they were told that this is just anti-Zionism, it's not anti-Semitism. The Jews who fought back came to be known as Refusenik, and their struggle for freedom became a watershed chapter in post-Holocaust Jewish history. It was filled with biblical-level drama. It had the pacing of a Hollywood thriller. It led to the exodus of 1.5 million Jews from the USSR. It actually helped bring down the Soviet Empire. 1 million Soviet Jews came to Israel. They helped turn the country into the technological powerhouse it is today. 500,000 of them went to America, my family included. Refusenik activists, who were at the heart of this struggle, saved their fellow Soviet Jews from enforced assimilation, and in doing so, they became models of courage and inspiration for 2 generations of Jews everywhere. Now, you may not think that your life has much in common with those Soviet Jews. After all, you live in a democracy, not a post-totalitarian one-party dictatorship. But the similarities are too striking to ignore. They may not be KGB agents surveilling your every move, but you're harassed by mobs chanting recycled Soviet slogans. You may not stand accused in Kafkaesque trials, but you are judged in kangaroo courts of TikTok and Instagram. You may not be sent to a Siberian prison colony, but you live under constant risk of losing the freedom to be who you are. Like your Soviet peers, you are pressured to conform to an anti-Semitic reality at your universities and the rest of your lives. Like them, your success depends not only on talent and hard work, but also on your willingness to pass ideological tests. The internal split that comes from hiding your true self is something former Soviet Jews know intimately. The common thread in all of this is your Jewish identity and your connection to the Jewish people. The systems and institutions may be different, but the goal is eerily familiar: to get you to sever the parts of your identity to connect you to Israel and ultimately to the Jewish story. The Soviet regime built an elaborate ideological program to erase the fundamentals of Jewish identity and to reshape the Jew into a version more acceptable to the regime. Today's campus ideologues have built their own programs using strikingly similar language and ideas. This ideological assault isn't abstract, it's concrete and well documented. Even before October 7th, a report by the Amcha Initiative concluded that Jewish students faced a pervasive, coordinated assault on their identity, one aimed at redefining, denigrating, and suppressing it. These attacks came not just from peers, but from professors and administrators. Importantly, they reached across campus life, in classrooms, student organizations, and online spaces. They included efforts to dissociate Jewishness from Zionism, the defamation of Zionist Jews through anti-Semitic conspiracy tropes, and the exclusion of pro-Israel expression from acceptable discourse. Things, of course, have gone much worse since then. And this is precisely where the Refusenik story becomes directly relevant to you and to our times. The Refusenik movement is often remembered primarily for its struggle to emigrate from the USSR, to help Soviet Jews rejoin the Jewish people in the Jewish state. But actually, something far more complex unfolded over the quarter century of the movement. At its core, it was a battle for identity and a connection to the Jewish people. The Refuseniks resisted a totalizing system that aimed to place Zionism and Israel outside the bounds of the acceptable. They ultimately defeated that system, and if they can do it, so can you. The Refusenik movement emerged after the Six-Day War in 1967. Israel's victory stunned the world and awakened something powerful for Soviet Jews. For the first time, they felt pride in their Jewish identity and a longing to learn about and connect with the Jewish state. But the USSR prohibited immigration. Those who applied for exit visas and were refused came to be known as refuseniks. Branded as traitors, fired from jobs, expelled from universities, and driven to the margins of society, they endured years, sometimes decades of persecution. Pushed to the wall, some turned to activism. They expanded their struggle from the right to emigrate to their right to live as Jews. In a system that had obliterated Jewish culture and identity, they organized and worked together to rediscover what it meant to be Jewish. Under a regime that demonized Zionism and Israel, they learned all they could about both. They carried that identity proudly into trials, prison cells, and labor camps. In doing so, they earned the respect and sympathy from their fellow political prisoners and other non-Jewish dissidents. Their actions inspired an international campaign of support. It was actually initiated by a British Jew, Jacob Birnbaum, and was initially led by American students. It ultimately mobilized Jewish grassroots across the United States and around the world, including very much here in the UK. This grassroots movement pressured Western governments, staged protests, and brought global attention to the oppression of Soviet Jews. It transformed what could have remained a marginal human rights issue into a powerful international cause that cut to the heart of the Cold War. For Jewish communities around the world, it became a central force in their communal and political engagement. And now to the core question that lies at the heart of the book, the meaning of the term refusenik. The term refusenik was originally coined to reflect the refusenik's victimhood status. It was a passive term, reflecting their status as having been denied exit permits. But there is another way to see it, and this is how the movement leaders, in fact, saw themselves. Before the system refused them, they refused the system. By applying to emigrate, they rejected the totality of the Soviet paradigm, including its ideology, bureaucracy, censorship, and coercion. But importantly, not all of them wanted to emigrate, and not all of them thought that that alone is sufficient. More than anything, they rejected a life apart from the Jewish people, history, culture, language, and tradition. They refused to accept the anti-Zionist anti-Semitism they faced as normal. They refused to accept the inferior status assigned to them. So powerful was their longing to rejoin the Jewish story in all of its richness that they were willing to risk everything for the chance to do so. And in the book, I discuss stories of the refuseniks who were repeatedly jailed, repeatedly put into the gulag, simply because they were working to revive and really to resurrect Jewish culture, which was a term they used to describe Jewish history, religion, the Hebrew language. This alone was enough to land them in prison. In the book, I pair stories of the refuseniks with the stories of contemporary Jewish activists. Like their Soviet predecessors, today's young Jewish activists aren't just pushing back against a specific movement or argument. They're rejecting a reality that tells them to disown their Zionism and connection to the Jewish homeland in order to belong. They refuse to accept the idea that they have to adopt a Jew-hating ideology in the name of social justice. They refuse to accept a profoundly distorted version of Jewish history that recasts Zionists as settler colonialists, Gaza as the new Warsaw Ghetto, and Israel as a genocidal regime akin to both Nazi Germany and apartheid South Africa. Incidentally, this is a story that the USSR began pushing to the global left some 60 years ago. Each chapter of my book offers a lesson drawn both from the original Refusenik story and that of today's activists. These lessons mark habits of courage learned under pressure. Let me name them briefly. Reclaim your Zionism, educate yourself and others, find your comrades in arms, do the unexpected, reject victimhood, and lead with Jewish. The actions of the original Refuseniks changed the trajectory of the Soviet Jewish history. The new Refuseniks of today may very well be laying the foundation for a new way of being Jewish in Europe, America, and beyond.
Izabella, really interesting, and even in that short passage, I have many, many questions and interesting things to try and tease out. Let me just say, firstly, thank you to the Z3 Project for being a part sponsor of this event, and also to the Jewish Chronicle. And huge and warm and authentic thanks to the University of Westminster. They are really, and they say clearly that they want to be a partner with us when we put on events like this. We don't pay them. They want us to be part of the university space in which we are able to put on these events. And for normal people on campus, that's just normal, but it's not normal for us. So a really proper, serious, thoughtful thank you to the University of Westminster and to Dibyesh Anand. I want to turn to Samantha Cass. I've been kind of in and around this kind of business for, I don't know, depends how you count it, 30 years, 40 years. Every year, the Jewish community in Britain and actually elsewhere throws up these fantastic spokespeople. It finds them and it creates them and it throws them out there into the world to organize and educate and create Jewish community amongst students and a Jewish political community and a Jewish social community. So just to say, I see these 22-year-olds kind of every year, and I kind of forget who's who, right? But every time they are smart and brilliant, and Samantha is one of those. And also, just to say to Samantha also, Samantha could be comfortably, tucked up at home in front of her log fire or whatever, but she's here doing another event. This is Holocaust Memorial Week. She's done many events, and these guys spend their lives zooming around the country doing events like this. So again, a proper authentic thank you to Samantha, and you would like to say something for us.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Is that okay? Perfect. It's an honor to speak here tonight, particularly to relay the words of Izabella about a topic that has become not only professionally central to me, but personally urgent. How do we inspire and enable Jewish students to express their voice on campus, one defined by pride, resilience, and determination, rather than only looking at universities through the lens of polarization, marginalization, and no-go zones? In my role as head of campaigns, I lead the Union of Jewish Students to ensure that Jewish students are listened to, understood, and supported, and that anti-Semitic incidents are handled by those who recognize the impact the current campus climate has on Jewish life. But students don't only want to be protected, they want to be empowered and enabled to lead. They want the skills to speak up, to build coalitions, to resist the isolation that anti-Semitism is designed to create. And yet, time and time again, students tell us that they are forced into heavily politicized arenas simply to defend their right to exist on campus. Now, you can take many things from tonight, but one thing that I would prioritize is the need to listen to our Jewish students. We must value their voices, and we must center their lived experience in our institutional responses. Jewish students are engaging in the Union of Jewish Students' work in higher numbers than ever before, with more pride than ever before, and with more resilience than ever before. Behind this heightened engagement is a story of 2 years of profound emotion that Izabella has described so well. To be Jewish these past years is to feel our Jewishness more deeply than ever. Mourning, memory, connection, responsibility, defiance, and joy. And instead of running away, Jewish students have channeled these emotions into a bolder Jewish campus life. For example, next week begins Jewish Experience Week, or the acronym JEW, which is an aim to build allies by bringing hundreds of non-Jewish students into Jewish student spaces to watch Jewish student pride in action, rather than focusing on Jewish people as political footballs. Hearing from Izabella must remind us that when Jewish identity is questioned, Jewish students do not give in. They reject their victimhood status defined by media headlines, and they lead with their Jewishness headstrong. The future of British Jewry will be shaped by the campus leaders of today, but it's important to recognize that they are already leading, and they are telling the most important story of Jewish pride and resilience. To those of you in this room, our task is to ensure that this legacy does not exist in a vacuum, but is translated into courage and clarity in the world that they inhabit today. The rise of campus anti-Semitism is a challenge, but investing in student leaders, equipping them with the knowledge, skills, and confidence, that is one of the most hopeful and impactful forms of education we can offer. And as Izabella has so greatly highlighted, Jewish students do create real and effective change, and we must encourage and allow them to continue doing so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Thank you. We will go to the audience and ask for questions and points, but not quite yet, but very soon. I want to ask, I'm really fascinated by the idea of victimhood to defiance, and actually both of you mentioned the same theme. And it's funny, a little bit of me is a bit contrarian and says, do we have to be defiant? And very often I talk to Jewish students or Jewish people who are having terrible time in the place where they are at, and they ask me, what can I do? And I will go through things that they might do, but it will cause them much more trouble than they have already. And I always say to them, you do not have to do anything. You do not have to be the person who stands up to be hit. You do not have to do it. But anyway, the people who come to me to find out how to do it kind of want to do it. So I'm interested in that. We can't all be Natan Sharansky, right? I remember reading Sharansky's book, and I didn't quite know the story, but even towards the end of the book, he keeps on saying, and then they offered me to be released, and I said no, and I refused to be released on those terms, and I stayed, I wanted more torture, and I mean, Sharansky was a kind of extraordinary man, and I know he's been a mentor somewhat to Izabella, and I've met him too, but we cannot all be Sharansky. So here's a question, which is, I know you were telling me about this, that there were big and small ways in Russia to be a refusenik.
Well, that's exactly right. Is the microphone working? So first of all, Natan Sharansky wrote the preface or the foreword to the book, and he's a big part of the book. One of the chapters details his story, and I think he appears in other chapters as well, because you can't tell the story of the refuseniks without his name. He was really the symbol of the movement, and he has remained that because of his political involvement. And I would say that today he's possibly the closest figure we have to a consensus figure as the Jewish people today. So you're absolutely right, and I actually say that in the book, or say something to that effect, that yes, not everybody can be a Sharansky, but most importantly, not everybody needs to be a Sharansky. I think one of the really interesting lessons of the Refusenik movement, look, there were probably tens of thousands of Refuseniks in the USSR. Remember, again, who is a Refusenik? A person who applied to emigrate to Israel and was refused the visa, right? So we actually don't know. The numbers fluctuated, it depended, but let's say in the 80s there were tens of thousands. How many people were actually the activists in the movement? I would say maybe a couple hundred, and only maybe a dozen of them were like Sharansky and a few others who really were out there and knew that they would be thrown into the gulag and they would have to hold the line and do hunger strikes, Sharansky really underwent, horrendous torture, including force feeding. But it only takes a very small number of people actually to change the culture. And it works both ways. It's very interesting. So I think we need to understand this also against the people who stand against us. It actually takes a very small number of people who are really committed to create change. And so when I think about the Refusenik movement, I think about it sort of as concentric circles. So in the heart of it are those a couple hundred people who were right there, protesting and insisting and speaking to the Western press and meeting with Western politicians and being followed and chased by the KGB and then ultimately put in the gulag. And then around them was a concentric circle of people who were still activists, but maybe they took on something much smaller, a smaller task. Maybe all they did was to transport a pack of samizdat literature, self-published literature, subversive in the eyes of the regime, from point A to point B, right? For example, from the train station where it was delivered and deposited in a locker, and he was given the code to open it, and then he or she brought it to the local Hebrew teacher, okay? Maybe this is all they did. It was still real risk, but it was far less than being a Sharansky or even working, for example, someone who was the liaison to Sharansky or the liaison to the politicians in the West. And then around them, there was an even bigger circle of people who maybe all they did was greet their child at home in their kitchen, the famous kitchen conversations, and told them what you were told in school today about Zionism or Israel was wrong. This too is resistance. So I would never say, and by the way, the activists themselves, the young people I interviewed in the book, they say this themselves. One of them, Adela Kohab, says, look, not everybody wants to be or can be or should be an activist. Some people can be advocates and others can do something else. Find where you fit in. I think that what's important today is that we're not really led. There aren't really clear, in the sense of like the established Jewish community is a little bit lost, right? It's not really leading us. So I think what's really important is that every one of us does what we can where we are.
Thank you. You talked about the erasure. You talked about holding our Zionism. And then you talked about the erasure of our identity, I think. I can't read my own writing. The erasure of our Zionism. And it struck me that in a way, I think the Zionism that we are imputed to have, which is meaning that we are complicit with genocide, we are supporters of apartheid and imperialism and the rest of it, is kind of thrust upon us without our consent and without our participation. And so the question of our Zionism is, I think, a really live one, because I think everybody has, not every Jewish person, but the overwhelming majority of Jewish people have their own particular relationship to the history of Zionism and to the State of Israel. And I mean, I'm looking around this room, I can see so many people who have really had immense courage in this room and who have stood up against some horrors. Actually, that's the book I want to write next, is the book about those stories, to just go through those stories, because in a way they are all different, but in a way they are all the same, and they are all about Jewish people being in a space in which they thought that they were at home, and then finding out suddenly that they are not at home. Samantha, I wanted to come to you. You talked about lived experience, which I thought was really interesting. It was a phrase that resonated with me because I was at a conference 2 weeks ago when somebody who's a leader of the Birkbeck Center for the Study of Antisemitism told us, firstly, that there is no evidence that antisemitism has risen since the 7th of October, and secondly, that we should not rely on Jewish lived experience as evidence to tell us what antisemitism is and isn't. And interestingly, kind of formally, I might go along with that to some extent about lived experience, but that's not because I want to erase lived experience.
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize the individual impact that various different students have experienced. And I won't sit there and say that anti-Semitism doesn't exist on campus, because it very much does. And we've seen that since October 7th, anti-Semitism has increased by 413% within 2022 to 2023, and then 2023 to 2024, and has continued to level at a really alarming pace. And we can look at statistics, but actually when we sit and speak to the individual students and hear their testimonies and how that has created an uncomfortable campus culture altogether, we can recognize exactly where the changes within the university sector, within the higher education sector, where we can begin to make those changes and embed that within a wider structure to making effective change. And that comes through emboldening those voices to make sure that what they've experienced will be able to empower and improve the next generation of students who will enter the university pipeline, and also encouraging them that actually by sharing what you've experienced and also sharing the defiance piece of actually, like, I'm still a student at university, I'm still getting my degree, I'm still going to Friday night dinner, I'm still having fun as a Jewish student, will inspire, again, those sixth formers who are thinking about which universities are the safest for Jewish students, which is a silly thing to do, because you should be thinking about university as a space of what has the best course for you. Is it campus or city? Does it have good pubs, like good social life? You shouldn't be thinking about anti-Semitism as the main factor for your university experience, and we actively discourage that mindset for parents and students when they're thinking about university. But actually highlighting the negative experience and then linking that back to the positives of Jewish life is incredibly important, to both be able to celebrate Jewish identity, but then also to enact positive change.
It's so tough, isn't it? Because if you speak to somebody who thinks that the campuses are riddled with anti-Semitism, then you want to respond, well, actually, that's not quite the whole story. And actually, you know, Jews can have a place and can be Jews and can be students. But then if you have someone who says, oh, well, there's no anti-Semitism, then you want to fight back against them. And it's a really difficult kind of double story to tell. I wanted to ask you, Izabella, actually maybe both of you, about this idea, and it seems to be quite a current debate almost. You said anti-Zionism is not organic. It's not something that just kind of appears by itself. And I was really interested to ask about that. So one of the interesting things about talking to people about Soviet anti-Zionism is because it's really obvious that in the Soviet Union it was not organic. It was designed and it was pushed by great, big, powerful machines who knew how to design and push ideology. And that's one of the reasons we want to talk to people about Soviet anti-Zionism, because many people who embrace just ordinary opinions that seem to be really normal anti-Zionist opinions at the moment do not know that they are coming up with the same ideology that was invented in the organs, offices in Moscow. So clearly, Soviet anti-Zionism was not organic. What about the anti-Zionism we see today? So we hear a lot of people who want to kind of follow the money, and they talk about, you know, Qatari money or this money or that money, and they say that you hear all kinds of things, you know, who paid for the tents in the encampments, and of course there is money, and the money is important. And trying to build an NGO, I'm much more conscious of the importance of money than I ever was about in building a thing that can change people's views. But it also seems to me that it doesn't matter how much money was spent by whoever, if anti-Semitism was not exciting to people, if people didn't want to embrace anti-Semitism, if it was not attractive, then it would not matter. And so it seems to me that in many ways it is organic, or at least partly. What do you think?
Well, you know, the way you asked this question, I think the answer is both. Because what's not organic is that people did not just come up with the idea that Zionism is racism just by sitting in a circle and thinking, well, how can we bring more justice to Palestinians? You know, or they didn't just come up with the idea that Israel is an apartheid state on their own. You know, I often talk about some, you know, mythical students on the Berkeley, California campus, you know, who really want social justice. And so they one day came up with these ideas. These ideas, the reason they're so hard to defeat is that they are a product of an industrial strength propaganda machine, okay? And more than propaganda, it's influence operations, it's active measures. You know, it's something that was developed and tested out on audiences that count millions around the world. You know, imagine if you were doing this kind of test, right, that marketing firms do. You know, what does this audience like? What does that audience like? So, you know, the Soviets, the people who participated in the development of these ideas had this incredible opportunity to do that, which is why, for example, their campaign that was directed at Europe focused on the idea that Zionists are Nazis, because Europe has the memory of Nazism and Second World War. But when they turned their attention to African states, they didn't talk about Nazism so much, because there it's not a lived experience, and there they talked more about racism and South African apartheid. And so in different countries and in different groups, they use different ideas and different language. And so what I see today, you know, when people say, well, okay, so today, whatever was really crucial to the left at any given moment, they would equate the Palestinian cause with that. So if you read Soviet propaganda in the 60s and 70s, they would be equating the Palestinian cause with the cause of the South African, those who were fighting against South African apartheid, and with the Vietnam War, and with the revolution in Chile. So because these were understandable to the activists of that time. And at the time, this cause was completely new, the Palestinian cause, and they were trying to make it understandable. We continue to see it today, right? Today, the Free Palestine movement continues to grab every cause that ignites the imagination of the public and equates and inserts the Palestinian cause into that. So in that sense, the language that is being used today by the anti-Israel left, and not even only the left anymore, is not organic. But I do think that it is quite organic to them now to believe that Israel is evil, because that has been, you know, injected into the bloodstream of the global left. It was injected into the bloodstream of the global left in the late 60s, early 70s. You know, people already in 1970 or 71, observers of the far left began to notice that on the far left, they use the word Zionist in the same way as the far right used the word Jew. They already understood back then that anti-Zionism was a new anti-Semitism. And by like 72 or 73, essentially all of the global left speaks in this language. And so in that sense, you could say that probably for certain parts of the left, and the left is very diverse, but for certain parts of the left, being anti-Israel and viewing, not just anti-Israel, but viewing Israel as the source of all evil and trouble and problem and wars and all the horrors that befall humanity, actually comes as a package with the belief that, we fight imperialism, we fight capitalism, and therefore we also fight Israel and Zionism. So in that sense, I think it's both.
What do you think, Samantha? How, like the 250,000 people who go on demonstrations against Israel, how do they know that they're not supposed to go on demonstrations against the Iranian regime? Like, how do they know? Like, nobody's telling them, nobody's paying them, there's not some great propaganda message, but they know. How do they know?
I mean, kind of to agree with what you were saying about this idea of kind of reusing old slogans and sayings. In November, I think it was November, there was a National London rally for Palestine, March for Palestine, and there was a student delegation block that went. And there was a student from the University of Oxford who was recorded saying, like, we've been workshopping this chant, please join in. And he goes, put the Zios in the ground. Now, Zios is not a new saying. To put Zios in the ground is not new. It's not organic. It's a slur coined by the KKK that is an explicit reference to Jewish people. And so I think we are seeing this, again, return of the same kind of ideas. And when we look at this Zionists off our campus, that's also not new. Back in the 80s, Jewish societies were being suspended and disaffiliated from their student unions. And we're seeing that reappearance and resurgence, and it goes up in highs and lows. But I think it's very easy to join in on something. And I think one thing that we've noticed post-ceasefire is that when it comes to the protests that are happening on campus, they aren't as large in number, but the extremist rhetoric that we are seeing during those protests and on social media, which is something that is new, that didn't exist back in the 80s, in the same way, I think that the rise of social media, the rise of that extremist rhetoric that's kind of being allowed to be permitted on social media under the guise of saying resistance rather than Hamas, adds to that feeling on campus. And I think that's kind of the new element, is that rise of social media and the fact that lines become more blurred in that context.
Can I add something to this? So I think that what you were describing, I just want to add the word that I've been thinking a lot about, specifically in this context. Why are there no protests against the Iranian regime? The infrastructure is not there. Because what they've built and what you're describing, it's not just the language. The infrastructure is there. There is a rhythm. In the US, there are students for justice in Palestine on multiple campuses, right? They don't just exist. They have a program of action. One of my interviews was telling me how she realized once she got pulled into the struggle that there is a rhythm. So in the fall semester, Students for Justice in Palestine build relationships. Then by spring, and they reach out to groups that may not yet be in their circle. Then in spring, they introduce some anti-Israel resolution. And by the time the Jewish students are sort of collecting themselves to respond, the resolution is already there and it passes. So there is a rhythm, there is an infrastructure, and there isn't an infrastructure for supporting the protesters in Iran. It hasn't been built. And for the Free Palestine movement, it's been there for decades, and again, through the investments of money and energy and supply of content by the Soviets, also by various Arab groups and countries, that's what enables it.
I hope people have got questions ready. Izabella, I want to ask you one more thing before we go to questions, which is a little bit about America, actually, and the position of American Jews. I remember being in America 20 years ago and saying, but this stuff is happening on your campuses too, and it's coming here, and in fact it's already here, and why aren't you worried? And there were some idiots who said, oh, don't worry, the Jews in America are powerful. And some of those idiots were Jews, and some of them were anti-Semites, and some of them were both, oddly. And is there, in a way, there's a big shock has come, I think, to many Jews who had not really been aware of some of the things that were going on, but in particular in the United States, where there was this feeling that Jews were not only completely acceptable, but they were, in fact, in some sense, the archetype of an American. And I wonder if... And then we had this discussion, didn't we, when you told me the title of your book, and I said, oh, they're not going to like that if you call it Be a Refusenik, because a lot of Jewish parents in particular still think that Jews are the archetypical Americans, and they're absolutely not ready to become refuseniks. So I wonder what your thinking is about that.
Well, I have a little anecdote. When I first, my very first book talk was actually before the book was published. I was at a conference at the Z3 organization that I'm a part of in Palo Alto. And the conference took place, I think, 10 days before the book came out. And they asked me to give a talk to a congregation that they had a strong relationship with. And so I started corresponding with that congregation about the title of the talk. And I said something like, I used the word defiance in the title. I think it may have been actually what I used today, from victimhood to defiance, and then, semicolon. And they write back to me and they say, we love everything. We love you. We love the description of the talk. We want all of it. Can you take out the word defiance? And I was surprised, and at first I got a little bit angry. I was like, well, this is my talk, you're not going to dictate to me what I'm going to say. And then I thought, no, I'm going to find out. I want to find out what they're thinking, what came up for them. And so I asked them, I said, why not why? What comes up for you when you hear the word defiance? Because, there was that movie that I thought all American Jews loved,
yeah.
Defiance, right? So I thought it's great. I mean, the Belsky brothers. And they said to me, well, we want our children to be educated. We want them to be resilient. We want them to be courageous. But we don't want them to be defined. We want them to be really well integrated into the society around them. And what I thought then, and this is a congregation that, of course, like most congregations in the US, and especially in the wealthy Palo Alto, where young families can't afford to live, these are mostly older people. And I thought, you don't understand what's happening to your grandchildren on campuses, because you want them to be integrated, but it's not possible right now for them to remain who they are and not be defiant about it and be fully integrated. So I think that people are coming to a realization that this is the case. I agree with you that I think a few years ago, it was very hard for American Jews to imagine that they could lose their power. And I think that maybe, there are a lot of comparisons today to what happened to German Jews in the 1930s. But I think the most, or in general, to the climate in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, which, of course, I don't necessarily, we may be getting there, but I look at it differently. But I do think that what's apt is that German Jews also didn't think it could happen to them, right? German Jews also thought that they were powerful and integrated and etc. So it's a very difficult and painful moment for American Jews. And, there are all kinds of processes going on that we still don't fully understand. But, I'll mention the one thing I was telling you that I think does give me some hope. And that hope comes from the fact that I see, I do get I feel energy coming from grassroots organizations. Interestingly enough, whenever I give talks, I have a feeling that the organized Jewish community is, trying to find its way. It's trying to figure out, they have different constituencies. They're trying to figure out, what do we do? The grassroots are the ones where they feel what's happening very acutely and very directly. And they want to fight. And they come to me and they say, we love your book because your book is inspiring and empowering. It's just like what you were saying, that Jewish students want empowerment, and this is what the book does. And that to me is really delightful to hear. And it's also, I'll add, that it's not the first time in the history of American Jews, it's actually very apt that this comes up in this context, because in the struggle for Soviet Jewry, it was also the grassroots that led. The organized Jewish community took it a while to get on board. Once it got on board, once it really understood where kind of from where and to where, in what direction the wind was blowing, they understood that there was a real strong desire on the part of the grassroots organizations to work on behalf of Soviet Jewry. Then they joined and they brought all of their, whatever they had, money, connections, etc. And then it became a general struggle that really the vast majority of the Jewish community was part of. So I don't exclude the possibility that it will happen here as well. Maybe it's just wishful thinking, but this, I hope that it actually is real.
I promise not to go on too long today. People have had a working day, and we have some wine and nibbles upstairs, and everybody has a book that they want Izabella to sign, I think. But let's have some questions and comments from the audience. Let's please be sharp and brief, and let's have quite a few, and then we'll see. Yes, and we'll come back in a little while. But let's take a number.
Hi. I wonder, I'm a student at Birkbeck. I'm doing a master's there, and have come across some quite horrific anti-Semitism. I'm not Jewish, I'm an ally. And one thing I've noticed is it seems that this is sort of left to be the Jewish problem. I wonder, with the Refuseniks, how were non-Jewish people brought in to the fight and to stand up and potentially be that voice when Jewish people do just want to get on with their studies, be left alone and not have to stand up?
So I wanted to say let's take a load of questions and comments, but actually I really want to know the answer to that comment. Was there an input from non-Jewish people in the Soviet Union?
So I think there was. I'm pretty sure there was. So there were kind of multiple, you could say, multiple dissident movements in the USSR. So there was a dissident movement that fought for the change of the Soviet regime from inside, for reform, not change, but for the reform. So these were called the Democrats, people like Sakharov, to those who know. And actually, Sharansky was part of that movement first, and then he moved into specifically the Jewish movement. So my understanding is that actually the Jewish movement, the Jewish dissident movement, did work with the broader democratic movement and actually received input from them. And there is, and we don't know this for sure, but one of the stories I tell in the book is the story of the Georgian Jews who early on, in like 1967 or 68, wrote a really famous letter to Golda Meir, and this letter was broadcast. They signed it with their full names and addresses, and it was broadcast over the radio. So it's a fascinating story. The letter they wrote, it's in the book. It's an incredible letter. It's incredibly powerful and inspiring. And my understanding is that it may have been written by members of that democratic movement who were not Jewish. A lot of the members of that democratic movement did support the Jewish struggle because they understood, they saw clearly the anti-Semitism of the regime, and they wanted to support it.
Samantha, do you want to say something about non-Jews and allies and alliances?
Yeah, I mean, we're always really proactive in encouraging Jewish students to get involved with non-Jewish students. We also have our Tackling Anti-Semitism in Education program, which is supported and funded by the Department for Education in the government, in which we deliver 2-hour anti-Semitism awareness training sessions to any university, any student union, any campus, anybody who has a leadership role in the higher education sector, to enable and equip those leaders with the tools to then proactively defend Jewish student life on campus. If you have a Jewish society on your campus, I know that Birkbeck is a bit more complicated because it's all different times of the day. Get involved, chat with them, see if there are ways that you can reach out. Most London universities are quite near to each other. Find out other national events and see ways that you can join in, have those conversations with those students, see what they want from you to be the best supporter. It would be like my best piece of advice.
Brilliant. So now let's really get a whole load of comments from the floor, starting with you. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk, and I look forward to reading the book. Your work has, it kind of, when you say that the Jewish organizations have a hard time coping, they're in a state of confusion, I think partly it's because of the language used. So anti-Israel or anti-Zionist accusations or libels, they sort of slip the anti-Semitic target, because they say, of course we're not anti-Semitic. We have no problem with Jews. We have many Jews among us. We have problem with Jewish sovereignty, per se. They don't say that, but they say anti-Zionism. And I know from your work that there was a flip that happened in the Soviet Zionology, where they realized this, and they purposely, because of course this was directly after World War II, so they purposely developed a language, a series of libels, a whole program, which would purposely slip and evade the accusation of being an anti-Semite. So I wondered if you could talk about that.
Thank you. I want to go to more questions with the white shirt.
Hello, thank you. My name is Eitan. I'm at King's College London, senior lecturer. And thank you for writing this book. Now I have a book to give to Jewish students that come to my office with some challenging experiences. So really appreciate it. Thank you. I'm halfway reading through it. And the question I have is a bit reflexive. So what are some of the moral, ethical dilemmas you had negotiated with while writing this book? Thank you.
Just there, next to you.
Hi, I just have a question, kind of building on everything you've been saying. I guess anti-Zionism, is it all part of anti-West propaganda? So building on Israel as the last remaining colonial outpost in the Middle East, outpost of the West. And if that's the case, and it's all been ongoing for so many years, and we're all aware that it's actually permeated various unions, teaching unions quite deeply. What can be done about it? So resisting being as a student, that's one thing, but what can be done to fight it at a deeper level?
At the back, please. To that fantastic looking person who happens to be my daughter.
Sometimes you hear people say something along the lines of, you know, isn't it good for students, shouldn't students sometimes be made to feel uncomfortable? Isn't campus the place where people should, you know, figure out how to be around ideas that make them uncomfortable? And, you know, why are Jewish students such snowflakes, and they're always trying to make people stop sharing their ideas just because it makes Jewish students upset? What's the right answer to those kinds of questions?
Yes, Martin Bright. Among other things, I am now, I once worked for the Jewish Chronicle, but I now work for Index on Censorship, which came out of the dissident tradition in the 1970s in the UK, inspired by Refusenik and by those great dissidents who were opposed to what was going on. And interestingly, the Jewish element of that dissident tradition has sometimes been erased itself. I just wondered, I mean, what's amazing about this book is that it acts as a primer for action. And indeed, action as a dissident, as a refusenik. How does it then transfer to people who might be refuseniks in the authoritarian world that we might be moving into, and particularly an authoritarian world that might make common cause with Jews? So I'm thinking of Viktor Orban's call to Jews, saying that Hungary is now the safest place in Europe. So how do you square the fact that some of those people who might wish to be dissidents are actually those very people that are in the university up there suggesting that Jews should not be snowflakes.
Martin, will you pass it to your right, please? Thank you.
Hi, my name's Gideon Cohen. I'm a first-time attender. A little story, I'll keep it brief. Before October 7, I used to go to a lot of concerts, gigs and the like. And I've stopped going even though it was my escape, relief from my then undiagnosed autism. And I stopped going because I felt removed. I felt I didn't belong. I felt excluded. I felt that, and again, I think this is to do with this organisation, that lots of bands, artists, whatever I admired, were now questioning my right to be a Jew. What I'd like to, a couple of things, I think that happened because it was cool, but also, unlike students, it's very hard for me to find allies to go to gigs with. Is there anything from the Soviet Jewish experience and the contemporary Jewish student experience that I can learn from?
Or what can we learn from your experience? I guess that's what. And expanding on that, as a PhD student at University of the Arts London, and an Israeli as well, I'm quite aware of the complexity. First of all, somebody mentioned that there's a kind of a cut between Jews and Israelis for some reason. I don't know why. But apart from that, kind of drawing on the activism that you were talking about, I've never come across a post or an email from the Jewish students' union. I've never come across a Jewish holiday being celebrated, or a Jewish student or a lecturer that is being promoted on social media of my university. How do we kind of navigate this, isolation that is really different and unique, because other minorities are being represented, other countries, other religions, they are being represented in my own university, which is a massive university and includes 8 universities, yeah? And I'm really interested, how can we contribute to a kind of more interwoven Jewish society for students? And how can I feel that I have, a back in my university? And someone mentioned here that she saw, how Jewish students were treated at Birkbeck. At UAL, Jewish students are treated also badly. I personally went through a very traumatic experience. And it's not that there are not reasonable people in the university that are non-Jews as well that can help. But how do we get to all these people?
Thank you. A couple more. The person there with the white shirt.
With regard to the fact that, I think it was a fact, there's the point that the Soviet Union voted in favor of the United Nations vote for the State of Israel. If I'm not mistaken, they did, in spite of everything else. Is there any, I don't understand why they did, but has that vote, the reasons they did the vote, has it got any relevance to the situation today?
And they sent weapons via Czechoslovakia. Yes. Can you pass it back, please, to that person?
What you're giving us is, I think, for the first time, of your clarity about how to understand the ideology, how to understand the ideology of anti-Zionism, anti-Israel, anti-Semitism, and to recognize it. And that's incredibly valuable. But how do we also create an environment for those Jewish students who do genuinely really struggle with the contemporary reality of what is happening in Israel and want to find their voice and not to be and to be able to sort of preserve their ability to think about it and to understand the ideology that is around them. And I feel that's really important because it's another thing that I think I certainly struggle with in my role in the Jewish community. I think I also want to say, so that's a real question. I want to ask a really ignorant question, and I apologize in advance. Please, can you explain to us what was the motive of this Soviet anti-Semitism? Was it straight, classical anti-Semitism? Was it the Jews as representative of capitalism and the West? I'd really like to, I'm sorry it's such a basic question.
Not an ignorant question at all. Thanks very much.
And I'm thinking back to what you said, Dave, about the Birkbeck thing and the idea that there's not an increase in anti-Semitism. I really do understand that when they do that research, that they look at a group of people over a period of time and they say 87% of people are favourably orientated towards Jews in the UK, and that doesn't change. And they look at the numbers of reported incidences, and we can see, well, obviously, people might be reporting more. I don't think counting numbers or looking at attitudes of stable groups of test subjects captures the ideological change that is kind of sweeping through our culture, and particularly the places that form our culture, such as the academy or the BBC or all these other places, and which is so much harder to get hold of, is the cultural change. It's very hard to measure it. It's not popping up on statistics anywhere.
Thank you. I want to go over here.
I just want to say two things then, really. It relates to the organic question, but also to the grassroots way of thinking. One big difference now, particularly here, I think particularly in the United States, particularly in Western Europe, and I would now add Australia, and you can't get much further away from Israel than Australia, is that it's a social phenomenon rather than a state phenomenon. So it's not a top-down problem that we're facing. Allowing, nevertheless, for your extremely important work on how this diplomatic, institutional, money-laundered project went on for a long period of time. But what is happening now is not a top-down one. It's in the entrails of society itself. And this relates to the point you just made about the climate and the ideas that one has to deal with, particularly in places like Birkbeck that somebody mentioned, whose centre should properly be renamed as the Centre for the Promotion of Anti-Semitism. But I think the answer to that is also your answer. So I want to support it very strongly, which is, because this is not a top-down thing, it has to be confronted as a bottom-up question too. And I want to say something optimistic here, right? The worm will turn. There have been in the past very powerful movements in society that have changed the world that we live in. And the one that you refer to here is one. Against the state, though. So we have a different problem, which is against the prevailing orthodoxy in society and in the institutions of civil society. And in Britain, in the universities, in the BBC, in the judiciary, in the police, these are institutions. And that's where the struggle has to take place.
Thank you. And here, please.
I'm very pleased that you've done your books. I've followed Soviet Jewry writings for many years, and I remember the struggle well from the time. Now, in the context of England, the most successful work of supporting the Soviet Jews didn't come from the students. The leader of the students was a close friend of mine. It came from a group of housewives called the 35s. They were sitting in Northolt, perfectly ordinary housewives. And I don't know if they knew anything about situationists. They did these dramatic events. They decided to harass the Soviet ambassador wherever he appeared. And they threw up on stages. They dressed up as ghosts. They were fantastic, and they did have an impact. So one of the things I do think should be considered is the encouragement of less traditional things. But much more importantly now, a dimension that we have in England, which you don't have, I think, in America, is a very long organised, very well-embedded trade union movement that has had anti-Zionism on its agenda as a regular thing, promoted with primary school teachers who have not the least interest in it, but get people out on the street. And they've been doing it for 50 years. So I think that's something we have to tackle. Thirdly, we have a government which, unlike America, has a very, very substantial issue with how to manage Islamic or Islamist radicalism. Most Muslims in this country are not radical. They're not even anti-Zionist. They want to get on with their life. But we have certain Islamic communities and traditions, a small minority, that do want to organize around such things. And this is very hard to counter because it also chimes with the British sympathy for oppressed minorities, and Muslims can be seen as an oppressed minority. And our government also has very strong interests in wanting to square very reactionary Arab regimes because they depend on them for sovereign wealth input. Very important to this country. And as long as we just talk about students and, at the level of universities, that sort of thing, and we don't even look at why does our government not use the perfectly good legislation it has
Thank you.
sanction?
Thanks. 1 minute.
Well, I wanted to just make a brief comment on David's question as to how do they know to go on demonstrations on one thing and not on another, and the issue of Soviet anti-Semitism. I think that the word Soviet anti-Semitism is a problem. Because actually, the formation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was the time at which Jews in Russia had the greatest freedom, had the greatest development of cultural possibilities. After the Tsar was overthrown, and the Tsarist was completely pogrom dependent, the attempt to overthrow the Russian Revolution by the former Tsarists, backed by interventionist armies from Britain and from the United States and other countries, it resulted in the greatest massacre of Jews until the Holocaust. What did overthrow the Russian Revolution was Stalinism. And what you're really talking about is Stalinist anti-Semitism, the recreation of the Tsarist prison house of nations, the Jew hatred of the Moscow trials, the Stalin-Hitler pact, the doctor's plot, the pogrom, which was the liquidation of the Jewish anti-fascist committee by Stalin, and in the other states, like the Slansky trial, which were always permeated with deep Jew hatred. And who are the people who lead the left in relationship today to go on these demonstrations? It's the followers of Stalinism. They are the real activists. If you look at the Stop the War Coalition, who organize a lot of these demonstrations, you'll find the editor of the Morning Star as a leader of that, and other members of the Communist Party, Stalinist Party. I think it's a misnomer, Soviet anti-Semitism, Stalinist anti-Semitism, and it's completely related to what the left is doing in this country and around the world.
Thank you. I'm not going to take any more questions. I've taken a lot. People want to drink. Izabella, you I've been kind to you by taking all those questions because you don't have to answer all of them. But if there's something you want to come back on, then please, well, if you want to answer all of them, you're very welcome.
How much time do I have?
You have as much time as you can keep the audience interested.
I was hoping you would tell me 3 minutes. Okay. So I'm gonna go to the easiest question first, and that is the question of why was what was the motivation of the USSR in launching this massive anti-Zionist campaign after 1967? Was it that they were deeply anti-Semitic themselves, or was it something else? So I think that there are different ways to answer this question. In my view, I think, you know, when you look at the individual level, certainly there were anti-Semites in the Soviet elites at the time. There's no question about it. The Zionologists that you mentioned, definitely the ideologues who created this whole structure, you know, equating Zionism with every evil under the sun, and specifically in particular, whatever the left viewed as evil, right? They were certainly motivated by personal anti-Semitism. But I don't think it's enough. I don't think it explains the massive resources that the Soviets invested in it. And I think, and this answer that I'm going to give, I think actually is relevant. It helps us understand the anti-Semitism of today. Because what I think the Soviets see is, after 67, is that their anti-Zionist ideology becomes a glue for many different groups that they're trying to glue together, very disparate groups, ideologically very different, you know, the various third world regimes that are the furthest thing from socialist, right? But they want to work with them because they're trying to build this anti-Western coalition and to create this anti-Western echo chamber, anti-Western public opinion. So, you know, so there's the New Left, and there are the Trotskyists, and there are the Black Panthers, and there are, you know, Stalinists, and there are people who, you know, who admire the new kind of the national liberation movements. These are all very diverse groups, right? And then you also take the, I don't know, people like Indira Gandhi, and then you take all the leaders, the dictatorial leaders of African regimes. It turns out that the anti-Zionist rhetoric just helps to bind all of them together for various reasons. And it becomes a very effective tool in their primary struggle. What is their primary struggle at the time? The primary struggle is against the US. It's the Cold War. And so, you know, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism as a political tool, and in their case as a geopolitical tool, I think it's really important to understand it that way, because otherwise you can't explain the massive resources they were investing in it. And I think that in many ways, many of the actors today are probably motivated in the same way. You know, because when somebody like Candace Owens suddenly discovers that anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, the idea that the Russian Revolution was a product of a Jewish conspiracy, you know, a myth debunked by countless historians. I was shocked when I saw her replaying it for millions of people. But what does she see? She sees that it brings her so much attention and so many likes and monetization. You know, anti-Semitism sells, and different people find different kind of, they're motivated in different ways by the success they get from deploying anti-Semitic tropes. So I think that that helps us to understand what's going on today. Let's see, on Soviet Jews and Stalinist anti-Semitism, look, I lived in the USSR. You know, when I first encountered, it's very interesting to me because I think to call this anti-Semitism Stalinist is a very British thing. I've never heard it used anywhere but in the UK. I don't quite know why. You guys had a very rich leftist culture. I think that's why. In America, I've never heard this word used. I grew up in Brezhnev's USSR. Yes, technically speaking, you could say that the people who were in charge at that time were the kind of the followers. They were people who came of age in Stalin's time. So you could call them Stalinists. It's probably not wrong. But for me, as someone who came out of there, it's a very strange term to use. You know, I just experienced it as part of the Soviet system. And that's why I used the term. Let's see, where next? So many questions. Okay, anti-Zionism as part of anti-Western propaganda. I touched on it a little bit. I think I think it's very much that today. And I actually happen to think that it's something, I think that it became obvious to a lot of people once the protesters, certainly in the US, started burning American flags. And I think that in some ways, it, you know, we talk about how Jews stand alone, how Jews don't have allies. I think we have more allies. We sometimes are picky about our allies. I think that American Jews especially really want the left to love them. And, you know, I've been saying that, look, you know, it's starting to look like, you know, it's a, you know, we can use the metaphor of a couple where, you know, one partner leaves, you know, because the left has left, like the left has married somebody else now, and American Jews are still standing there and like looking longingly at that door through which they exited, you know, and there are all these people over here who want to court us, you know, and we're like, well, no, we don't fancy them. We really fancy the left. We really want to convince the left. And so, you know, just to be a contrarian a little bit, you know, I try to tell people, you know, try to love others, you know, I think it's okay, you know, and also, you know, and then people say, well, you know, but these people, they don't really love us as Jews, you know, they just have their own political agendas. Well, first of all, the left has their own political agendas too, and also, you know what, we don't have to marry these people, like we can just date, you know, I think an alliance doesn't have to be forever. It can be a lot more pragmatic. So I think it's perhaps that's kind of a rethinking that we need to do. And now I don't even remember why I got to this. Okay. Oh, about anti-Western propaganda, that's why. Because, you know, I think that there are people, and again, I feel more comfortable speaking about America. I just don't, it's the country I understand much better than the UK. But, you know, I think there are people who want to be our allies because they understand that the side that's against the Jews is also against the West. You know, it's also the side that's against our culture, the Western culture. In America, a lot of times these people are in the flyover country, you know, and Jews tend to take them for granted. I think actually we should be investing fewer resources into fighting the radicals on the coasts and more resources in just making friends and explaining ourselves to the people who, you know, they haven't made up their mind yet. They are persuadable. You know, we shouldn't leave them one-on-one with Wikipedia, which we know, you know, it's where they will go to find out what is Zionism, what is Israel, what happened on October 7th. We just should be building more bridges with people who I think we are, who's, you know, the one thing that unites us with them 100% is that, you know, they don't want you know, they appreciate the countries that they live in and want to preserve them. Let's see. Why are the Jewish people such snowflakes? Right, the question of, you know, free speech. You know, I actually want to hear maybe David speak about that because I'm going to toss the ball in his court. You know, look, free speech. I don't know, when people are expounding on conspiracy theories that we know to have been harmful, it's obviously, you know, we're not being snowflakes. We know the outcomes of those conspiracy theories. So some of it is explaining that to people, but education also doesn't always work. So I don't know, David, from your rich experience of dealing with those circles.
From my rich experience, I'm going to have to answer my daughter's question, yes. Am I? I think, no, now I've just gone blank. I might come back to that in a sec. Samantha, please have a last word.
Yeah, we relish something called productive discomfort, the act of entering a conversation that you know will make you uncomfortable, but at the end of the day, you're going to learn something productive from it. In a lot of these situations, there is nothing productive about the campus environment that's been created, purely because there is an anti-normalization rhetoric where any mention of Israel or Zionism, or even in some cases Jewish identity, is completely cancelled and you're not allowed to enter into conversations. And if you can't enter into conversations, then that's not productive, and then you've just created and facilitated a space of uncomfortability, I suppose. And I guess that's how I would approach the situation, that if you are willing to have an academic debate and argument filled with openness and a determination to learn something or be open-minded, then that's great. And then, you know, you should actively enjoy that feeling of maybe being questioned about your ideas and your opinions. But if that's not the conversation that you're entering, and it's more just a series of harassment and intimidation, then I don't think that that is snowflake behavior.
I think very much that we should be teaching our kids, Jewish kids and non-Jewish kids, to toughen up and to be able to handle themselves on campus, and to be able to handle themselves in these discussions, and to be able to handle themselves in seminars when they find that their lecturers are embracing an anti-Semitic framework and legitimizing it and pushing it. I absolutely think that Jewish kids ought to be learning how to look after themselves intellectually. But I also think, well, there are people, as I said, actually, people in this room who have absolutely not been snowflakes, who have stood up, who have spoken, who have been persistent, who have continued to speak, and who have been battered, actually, and to live in a world where people think that you are complicit in genocide and in racism and in apartheid, to live in a world where people assume that because you stand up against anti-Semitism, then you are Netanyahu's poodle, to live in a world where people assume that Israel is committing genocide and you are part of it, to live in a world where your whole work is delegitimized and trashed because of it. It's a world that would break people who were not snowflakes. And I think the answer probably is that there's a difference between being able to handle yourself in debate and in discussion and to understand evidence and to be able to take on board other people's views and to deal with anti-Semitism. And I think that is something that one of the key things we need to communicate, really. Isabella, I'm going to give you the last word.
So I just want to address a couple more questions. I want to address what Philip said about how what we're facing today doesn't come from top down, it comes from the bottom up. I think it's a really interesting, it's an important observation, because for me, you know, when I think the first kind of shock, I experienced a big shock that sort of undermined my assumptions about living in free society when I realized that actually you don't need a government to sort of enforce compliance with certain social norms that you would think are really anti-democratic and anti-free. You know, at first I think realized it in 2020, which, you know, in the US that was the year when it was, of course, the pandemic, but it was also the year of all of the cancellations, you know, and people getting just completely torn to pieces on social media and self-censorship ensuing. And I remember thinking how shocking it was to me that here we are in a country that was free and there was no government censor, but people really submitting to social norms that were being asserted so strongly and so powerfully over social media. So, you know, it's a very interesting phenomenon, because in the USSR, yes, anti-Zionism came from the top down. But, you know, it doesn't matter. At some point, like once that's in the culture, once the blood is in the water, it almost doesn't matter where it came from originally. You know, because I remember talking to my dad, who hates it when I talk about him, so I hope this will get edited out. But you know, when he was very young when he first went to defend his postdoctoral dissertation. Very unusual, you know, very, like, he was like 28 or something else, or something like that. Very complex topic, a physicist, brilliant, if I may say so. You know, so he had to meet, before he defended it, he had to meet with it's like a pre-dissertation kind of committee that had to approve his topic and going on to defend it. So he meets with them, and his dissertation advisor had just emigrated, like a couple months before that. And so my dad goes in, and they start asking him questions that were completely unrelated to the topic of his dissertation. And he understood immediately what was going on. I mean, it's so easy, right, to just, dissertation is such a narrow thing, right? You can just ask questions that are not related to it, and that's it. Nobody's going to know the full breadth of everything. And so they were asking him questions specifically to make him fail. And he understood immediately what was going on, and and so he didn't pass, and they didn't allow him to go on and defend his dissertation. And so I asked him, I said, so were the people on that committee anti-Semites? And he said, no, I don't know, they weren't. They just sensed the climate. They just understood that if they allowed me to pass 2 months after my dissertation advisor emigrated to Israel, then they would have trouble, that they would, and it's like it's unspecified trouble, but they might get a call from somebody, who would tell them, well, why did you do this? Or it might impede their own progress, they were maybe hoping for an advancement and they wouldn't get it. So they just sensed the atmosphere and they aligned themselves with it, and they moved with it. And so, there's something, we have sociologists in the room. Maybe this is something that they can explain to us, maybe over drinks, how it works, why it is that a society just simply obeys certain norms once the norms are there. And it's a very striking thing. So I don't know, it's not an inspiring finish. Maybe on the inspiring note, I would say that, yes, thank you for bringing up the 35s. I mentioned them in the book. They're brilliant. Sharansky, one of his favorite anecdotes, which I also mentioned in the book, is that the KGB tried to dismiss the movement for Soviet Jewry by saying, what is it? It's just students and housewives, it's nothing. And he just loved it. And he took it on and he said, yes, a movement of students and housewives is a real movement that's it has real power. It has that grassroots power that will have energy and success, and eventually it did.
Thank you, Izabella Tabarovsky.